The United States sits on top of the world's most powerful oil infrastructure. Meanwhile, just 1,500 miles south, Venezuela controls the largest proven oil reserves on the entire planet, bigger than Saudi Arabia, bigger than Russia, bigger than anyone, and yet, for over 2 decades, these two neighbors have barely done business together. But here's what almost nobody is talking about in 2026. That might be about to change. And if it does, the ripple effects could reshape everything you think you know about global energy markets, gasoline prices, and geopolitical power. The question isn't whether Venezuela has the oil, it's whether the United States can actually access it, what that would cost, and why the answer to this question could determine which countries rise and fall in the next decade. So, how did we get here? And more importantly, what happens next? To understand what's happening right now in 2026, we need to go back to a moment when Venezuela was something completely different. In the 1970s, Venezuela was the envy of Latin America. It had the highest GDP per capita in the region. Its currency was strong. Its middle class was thriving. Caracas looked like Miami. The country was producing over 3 million barrels of oil per day. And more importantly, it was doing so efficiently, profitably, and reliably. The United States and Venezuela weren't just trading partners, they were deeply integrated. Venezuelan crude flowed north to American refineries specifically designed to process its heavy oil. American technology and expertise flowed south. It was a symbiotic relationship that enriched both nations. But here is the twist that almost nobody saw coming. Having the world's largest oil reserves doesn't guarantee prosperity. In fact, as we're about to see, it can become a curse that destroys everything it touches. Because by 2026, Venezuela's oil production has collapsed to barely 600,000 barrels per day, a fraction of what it once was. The country that should be one of the wealthiest on earth has experienced an economic catastrophe so severe that over 7 million people have fled. Its infrastructure is crumbling, its refineries barely function, and the oil that once made it rich sits trapped underground, valuable in theory, but almost impossible to extract at scale. So what happened? How does a country with more oil than Saudi Arabia end up in economic ruins? And why is the United States suddenly interested again? The answer lies in a series of decisions that started in 1999. A choice that seemed reasonable at the time, but set off a chain reaction that nobody could stop. December 1998. Venezuela elects Hugo Chávez as president in a landslide victory. Chávez is a former military officer who promises to redistribute the country's oil wealth to the poor. His message resonates. Venezuela's oil profits had been flowing to a narrow elite for decades, while millions lived in poverty. Chávez promised change and people believed him. In his early years, Chávez got lucky. Global oil prices were rising. Between 1999 and 2008, oil went from $16 a barrel to nearly $150. Money flooded into Venezuela's government coffers. Chávez launched massive social programs, free housing, healthcare, education subsidies. Poverty rates fell. His popularity soared. But underneath the surface, something dangerous was happening. Chávez began to centralize control over PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, the state oil company. In 2003, after a failed coup attempt and a crippling oil strike, Chávez purged PDVSA of nearly 19,000 employees, including most of its experienced engineers, geologists, and managers. These weren't political appointees, they were the technical experts who actually knew how to find, extract, and refine oil. Why would Chávez gut his own oil company? Because he saw PDVSA as a threat to his political power. The old guard had supported the strike against him. He wanted loyalty, not expertise. He replaced the experts with political allies. Engineers were swapped for ideologues. The mission changed from maximizing production to funding social programs. PDVSA became a piggy bank for political spending, rather than a business focused on long-term sustainability. Here's the critical detail most people miss. Venezuela's oil isn't easy to extract. It's extra heavy crude, thick, sulfurous. and requires specialized technology and constant reinvestment to maintain production. It's not like Saudi light crude that flows easily. Venezuelan oil demands expertise, maintenance, and capital investment, and all three were disappearing. Throughout the 2000s, Venezuela's oil production begins a slow, steady decline, but because oil prices keep rising, the government's revenue actually increases. Chávez doesn't notice the warning signs because money keeps flowing in. In 2007, Chávez takes another fateful step. He nationalizes foreign oil projects, forcing companies like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips to either accept minority stakes or leave entirely. Most choose to leave. They take their technology, expertise, and capital with them. Venezuela celebrates this as reclaiming sovereignty over its resources, and on paper, it makes sense. Why should foreign companies profit from Venezuelan oil? But the practical consequence is devastating. The specialized technology needed to extract heavy crude leaves. With them, the joint ventures that brought in billions in investment disappear. The knowledge transfer stops. Then in 2008, oil prices crash from $150 a barrel to below $40 in just 6 months. Venezuela's entire economic model collapses overnight. The government had been spending oil profits as fast as they came in, sometimes faster, borrowing against future production. There was no sovereign wealth fund, no savings, no buffer. When prices crashed, there was nothing left. And here's where the situation spirals. To maintain social spending and stay in power, the government needs money, but PDVSA needs massive reinvestment just to maintain production, let alone increase it. The wells require constant maintenance. The refineries need upgrades. The infrastructure is aging. The government makes a choice. Spend the money on political survival now, not oil investment for the future. Production declines accelerate. By 2010, Venezuela is producing around 2.4 million barrels per day, down from over 3 million a decade earlier. By 2013, when Chávez dies and Nicolás Maduro takes power, production is falling faster. Maduro inherits a disaster, but instead of changing course, he doubles down. In 2014, oil prices crash again. This time, they stay low. The consequences are catastrophic. Venezuela's economy contracts by over 75% between 2014 and 2020, one of the worst economic collapses in modern history outside of wartime. Hyperinflation hits 10 million% at its peak. The currency becomes worthless. Food shortages become routine. Hospitals run out of basic medicines. Violent crime explodes, and oil production goes into freefall. By 2019, production drops below 1 million barrels per day. By 2020, it's around 500,000. The country with the world's largest oil reserves is producing less oil than Ecuador. Why? Because the infrastructure is collapsing. Wells are being damaged through poor maintenance. Refineries are operating at a fraction of capacity or shutting down entirely. Experienced workers have fled the country or retired. Spare parts can't be imported due to lack of foreign currency. Equipment breaks down and isn't replaced. But there's another factor that accelerates the collapse: US sanctions. Starting in 2017 and dramatically expanding in 2019, the United States imposes comprehensive sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector. The goal is to pressure Maduro's government by cutting off its main source of revenue. Venezuelan oil exports to the United States, which had been around 500,000 barrels per day, dropped to nearly zero. The sanctions work in the sense that they devastate Venezuela's economy, but they don't dislodge Maduro. Instead, they force Venezuela to find new buyers, primarily China, Russia, and India, often at discounted prices and under opaque arrangements that benefit intermediaries more than the Venezuelan people. By 2020, Venezuela's oil industry is essentially on life support. Daily power outages plague the country. Oil facilities sit idle. Tankers rust in ports. The expertise to restart production has largely emigrated. This is the key point. Venezuela's oil problem isn't primarily about reserves or geology. It's about infrastructure, expertise, and investment, all of which have been systematically destroyed over the decades. Between 2020 and 2025, there are several attempts to revive Venezuelan oil production, but each one fails for revealing reasons. China and Russia, despite being political allies, prove reluctant to make the massive investments needed. Why? Because Venezuela's track record of nationalizing foreign assets and changing contract terms makes it an unreliable partner. Even friendly governments won't risk billions when property rights are uncertain. Some sanctions relief is attempted. In 2022 and 2023, the Biden administration briefly eases some restrictions, hoping to incentivize political dialogue. A few American companies show interest, but the fundamental problems remain. Venezuela lacks the capital to rebuild infrastructure. The government still prioritizes short-term political spending over long-term investment, and the risk-reward calculus for foreign investment still doesn't work. Various international oil companies conduct assessments. Their conclusions are sobering. Restarting Venezuelan production at scale would require investments of $50 to $100 billion over a decade, along with stable legal frameworks, reliable contract enforcement, and technical freedom to operate. None of these conditions exist. By 2025, production has stabilized at around 600,000 to 800,000 barrels per day. But this is nowhere near the country's potential or what global markets need. Which brings us to 2026 and why this matters now more than ever. The global oil market is in a peculiar state. Demand remains strong. Economic growth in Asia continues, but supply is increasingly concentrated in a handful of countries, raising geopolitical risks. The US shale revolution has plateaued. OPEC maintains production discipline. Russia's oil sector faces its own challenges. Meanwhile, the United States faces a strategic calculation that's becoming harder to ignore. American refineries on the Gulf Coast were specifically designed to process heavy crude, exactly the type Venezuela produces in abundance. When Venezuelan oil stopped flowing, refineries had to source heavy crude from Canada, Mexico, and elsewhere, often at higher costs. Some specialized refineries are operating below capacity. There's also a political dimension. Having millions of Venezuelan refugees in neighboring countries creates regional instability. Colombia has absorbed over 2 million Venezuelan migrants. The humanitarian crisis creates pressure for solutions, and there's the China factor. As Venezuela has been shut out of American markets, it's moved closer to China, selling oil at discounts and granting concessions. Some US strategists worry about Chinese influence expanding in America's hemisphere. This creates a strange situation where multiple interests might align for renewed US-Venezuela energy cooperation. Refineries want the crude they're designed for. Policymakers want to address migration and counter China. And even some voices argue that engagement might be more effective than isolation for promoting eventual political change in Venezuela. But here's the enormous caveat: none of the underlying problems have been fixed. If you've been paying attention to history, this pattern should sound familiar. In the 1970s, Iran was a massive oil producer and close US ally. After the 1979 revolution, the relationship collapsed. Over 40 years later, Iranian oil remains largely shut out of global markets despite the country having some of the world's largest reserves. In Libya, the fall of Gaddafi in 2011 was supposed to bring stability and renewed oil production. Instead, the country descended into civil war, and oil production remains volatile and well below potential more than a decade later. Iraq, despite having the world's 5th largest oil reserves, took over a decade after the 2003 invasion to return to pre-war production levels, and required hundreds of billions in investment to do so. The pattern is clear. Once oil infrastructure collapses and expertise disperses, rebuilding is extraordinarily difficult, expensive, and slow even with international support. Without stable governance and rule of law, it may be impossible. Venezuela's situation is arguably worse than any of these examples, because the decline has been longer, more severe, and more systematic. Here are the numbers that should shock you. In 1998, Venezuela produced about 3.5 million barrels per day. In 2026, it's around 700,000, an 80% decline. To return to 1998 levels would require rebuilding almost everything from scratch. The wells themselves have been damaged. When oil wells aren't properly maintained, they can be permanently impaired. Pressure declines, water intrusion occurs, and restoring production becomes geometrically more expensive. The workforce has been decimated. Estimates suggest over 25,000 oil workers have left Venezuela since 2000. These weren't just any workers, they were petroleum engineers, geologists, refinery technicians. You can't replace that expertise overnight. The refineries are in ruins. Venezuela used to refine most of its own crude. Now it imports gasoline because its refineries barely function. So what should you take away from this story? First, resources don't equal wealth. Venezuela proves that having oil in the ground means nothing if you can't extract it efficiently. The real value isn't in reserves, it's in infrastructure, expertise, and institutions. This is why Norway is rich despite having far less oil than Venezuela. The resource is necessary but not sufficient. Second, short-term political calculations destroy long-term value. Every step of Venezuela's decline came from prioritizing immediate political needs over technical and economic sustainability, purging experts to ensure loyalty, spending oil revenue instead of reinvesting it, nationalizing assets to score political points while driving away investment. Each decision made sense in isolation but created a cascading disaster. Third, rebuilding is exponentially harder than maintaining. This is the lesson that should worry anyone thinking about Venezuela's potential role in 2026. Energy markets, even if sanctions were lifted tomorrow, even if a new government committed to reform appeared, even if international companies wanted to return, it would take a decade and hundreds of billions of dollars to restore production to historical levels. The deterioration happened over 20 years. The recovery would take at least as long. Here is the question we should be asking. What happens if the world is counting on Venezuelan oil to stabilize markets, but that oil never actually materializes at scale? In 2026, there's increasing talk about Venezuela as a potential solution to tight oil markets. Some analysts include future Venezuelan production in their supply forecasts. Some policymakers suggest that normalized relations could bring significant new supply online relatively quickly. But the hard reality suggests this is wishful thinking. The infrastructure isn't there. The investment climate hasn't fundamentally changed. The technical expertise has scattered. And even in the best-case scenario, with immediate sanctions relief and political reform, ramping up production from 700,000 barrels per day to even 2 million would take 5 to 7 years of intensive work and capital. This matters because energy security decisions made in 2026 based on optimistic assumptions about Venezuelan oil could prove dangerously wrong. If countries are counting on supply that doesn't arrive, the consequences for energy markets, economic growth, and geopolitical stability could be severe. So here is what we're left with as 2026 unfolds. Venezuela sits on an ocean of oil that the world increasingly needs, connected by geography and infrastructure to American refineries designed specifically to process it, at a moment when geopolitical and economic incentives for cooperation might be aligning. But rebuilding what was destroyed requires something that's been missing for 2 decades. Patient capital, technical expertise, institutional stability, and time. The big question isn't whether the United States and Venezuela could work together again on energy. It's whether they can do so in a way that actually produces results, rather than creating another cycle of optimism followed by disappointment. And that answer isn't written yet. What's your take? Are we looking at a genuine opportunity for Venezuelan oil to return to global markets, or another false start in a decades-long tragedy?